Welcome to Essential C.S. Lewis on YouTube, a feature of EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty. What would you say if I told you that there are words written by Lewis that have been hidden in plain sight that few people have noticed? Justin Keena is my guest today, and that's basically the premise behind the material he's published entitled C.S. Lewis Blurbologist. It was released in 2025 from Inklings Studies Supplement number 4. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thanks, William. Good to be here.
Well, now let's begin with defining blurbologist, or more importantly, the word blurb. It's one of those words that most people may not realize that they are already familiar with. So, what can you help us out with?
Yeah, people are certainly familiar with this word. I'd say it's at its core, it's a short descriptive summary of something, usually used for advertising purposes. So you could restrict it the way the Oxford English Dictionary does to a book, a blurb about a book, something that you print on a dust jacket or a wrapper, a concise plot summary or a short commendatory evaluation of it. But people are familiar with it all over the place. If you don't restrict it to a book, it's the little description you get on a Netflix show you're about to watch, or an Amazon product listing, or whatever it might be. Just that short, pithy, descriptive summary, usually designed to sell something to you. And in the case of Lewis's books, it's the short, descriptive summaries that were printed on the dust jackets of his books.
Okay. Well, now, why do you think that what you've discovered has evaded the notice by the majority of people and even some Lewis scholars?
Yeah, well, I mean, first I'll say that some of them haven't gone unnoticed, but it's only because Lewis's name is attached to them. The one blurb on his own works that has been noticed before is the Till We Have Faces one, because the publisher gave their summary and, you know, very positive evaluation of this new novel. But then on a part of the rest of the blurb, it has, and Dr. Lewis writes, and it gives some words that are attributed directly to him. So I'd say the first thing is just that most of the blurbs, all the rest of the books that he published, don't say that he wrote them on it. So it's just, you open the front flap, you look at it, and it's a paragraph about the book. You're not going to give it a second thought if you're just trying to decide whether you want to read the book or not. It's a quick thing to read. The other thing is that most people nowadays will buy books for Lewis in trade paperback, or they're just not crazy collectors like, me or Steve Beebe, or, people who collect first editions and then are particular about getting a dust jacket. And, so some of these books are just lost to time. They're not in people's libraries. People don't have the fragile paper that was printed in, during World War II or before, to be able to read it. And the other thing is that even if they do have it, subsequent printings of the same original book will, condense the blurb or take it out and replace it with review quotes. So sometimes it only existed on the first couple of impressions, and then it's just gone. It's a very ephemeral medium. The genre itself is just you print it on a piece of paper, it goes out in contemporary newspapers or magazines, and then it's just gone unless it's been preserved in someone's collection or in a library or archive. So I say it's hidden in plain sight, but only the plain sight of if you had the books in your shelf and you were looking at them all the time, and had them in your mind. So yeah, and like I say, there had been a few that were noticed, but they had Lewis's name attached to them. So part of the excitement of discovering or deciding to look at the blurbs that he wrote for his own books is to think, I've got these texts. They sound like him. Were they really by him? In a way, it was a challenge, kind of like the opposite of what Charlie Starr is known for, where he can have a piece of paper with ink on it, and he can try to authenticate the handwriting. But for me, the challenge was the opposite. What if I have just the words, no writing? Can I authenticate it just based on the context of it's on this piece of paper? that's attached to the original publication. What can I do to authenticate it without handwriting?
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes here. But it's interesting how you chose to summarize the key thoughts there, because only last week did it dawn on me. I thought, wait a minute, I don't have a true first edition of the Screwtape
Mhm.
letters, but I have the second printing, or that's what it's labeled, and
Right,
basically
right,
it's the second month or the second print. And sure enough, looking at your material,
right.
uh, I noticed that they didn't give the full blurb. They cut the bottom off of it, but that I did
Mhm.
have a thing that I never really thought about. Oh, well, that's something that Lewis wrote, or maybe that first sentence wasn't, but after that it was, and so
Yeah,
that was quite
exactly.
interesting. Yeah, so yeah, definitely a hidden in plain sight for those who maybe have a hardback edition. And I'll have to look at some of the other books that I have that are close to a printing that has the desk jacket.
And it was fun comparing them because I don't have all first editions. I've got, some that are like my screw tape. If you're going to buy a first edition screw tape, you've got some sizable disposable income. But if so that meant it meant a couple of things. Like number one, I noticed, I wanted to know which ones I had and which ones were different from the very first printings. But it also meant I had to track down the first printings. So getting in touch with libraries, sometimes they had facsimile reproductions, very difficult to find. I could only find one person who had a first edition, um, first printing, true first printing of the Allegory of Love. Even Spears and Bondage was easier to find
Huh.
because there was only one printing. It was easier to find a dust jacket of that particular book. But yeah, I had to make sure that each of the images that I assembled were from true first impression copies, and sometimes there are so many additional impressions that it's hard to find one that's truly original.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, but it made a fun. It gave me another fun reason to go back to my library and look at like who was reviewing it, what were people saying, how did they change and market his book. This is a whole new, um, not completely new. People have done Lewis reception studies, but it's a new angle of that kind of thing. People could take that in a further direction, looking at the evolution of different jackets and designs and how they were marketed for different countries and so on. So it's a whole other thing that I had to just put aside and demarcate. Let me just find the original blurb. That's the most likely thing that Lewis would have written, and see if I can sift out anything maybe his editors wrote versus what really sounds like him and it resonates with the rest of his published and or known works.
Hmm. Yeah, very, very interesting, fascinating. Now, also hopefully maybe fascinating is how you came up with the idea for what we know now as the final result that came out in 2025. So when did the seed was planted per se, or what do you recall? Because sometimes
Yeah, yeah,
it's
and
hard to reconstruct.
there's a couple of elements to it. The first thing, the main thing, is that I've been trying to collect every piece of published Lewis material that there is, and of course, the place to start is with the huge bibliographies that Walter Hooper made over the years. And having gone through all of those, line by line, uh, trying to find every essay, every quotation, every annotation of a book that's been published. There's quite a lot that's come out since his final bibliography and even since his last published collection of Lewis's works. All that to say, I got in touch with other Lewis bibliographers and the attempt to continue his work, particularly Steve Thorson. I was getting toward the end of the list of things that I needed to find, very obscure letters in journals or printouts of journal articles that had, one or two phrases or quotes from a Lewis, either a Lewis letter or some kind of note or fragment or something that's only available in the archives. And then I came down to finding some obscure differences between the first American and the first British printing of Till We Have Faces, because it turns out that there's material in the first British printing that's not in the U.S. printing, and vice versa. Like, so there are like the note at the end about Cupid and Psyche, the genesis of the myth, and so on. That I don't think is in the first UK edition. I'll have to check my own book to remember the details because it gets complicated. All that to say, I came across on the front flap or the back flap of the dust jacket these words that were attributed to Lewis on the jacket, and it made me think, well, what if he's got words on other jackets but that haven't been um, collected or documented yet? Now, it wasn't a totally novel idea because there is one person who had done an article um, expanding Lewis's bibliography, and the very first section of that short article, it's a few pages, is C.S. Lewis, the blurb writer, and he had found that Lewis wrote a couple of blurbs that Walter Hooper hadn't collected, but he also mentioned that Lewis had written about a paragraph that appeared on Till We Have Faces. So that was at the back of my mind as well. Like, okay, I know he's written blurbs for other people. He's done stuff for his own books. And then at the back of my mind also was, the copy of Preface to Paradise Lost that I'd been reading for years and years has a paragraph on the front flap. And I'm the kind of person who will read, I'll read the back of it. I'll look at the front. I'll see, what the reviewers say and see if I agree or not. I'll read the plot summary or avoid it if it's a book I'm looking forward to. And that particular paragraph on the Preface to Paradise Lost jacket had stuck with me. And it sounded to me like Lewis, and I kind of had assumed that it was him for several years. And then I thought, at some point, I wanted to, I can't remember what it was for, but a different project. I wanted to quote that, the idea came to mind where he talks about in that blurb wanting to remove obstacles to the enjoyment of Paradise Lost. And I thought, that's a great literary critical approach to take. And it just sounded like something that he would say. But, later on realizing, I can't quote this. People won't, you have to establish that Lewis actually wrote it if you're going to attribute it to him. And that was at the back of my mind. So there are a few things. And similarly, I remember seeing pictures of an early printing of Paralandra that very much sounded like Lewis, the printing of the jacket and the description of the book. And so those things were on my mind. And then I'm coming to, update my bibliography and realizing, maybe I just need to look systematically at the rest of the printed dust jackets and see what's there. And that's when I got excited about, let me go look through and see what I pulled, starting to pull things off my shelf and thinking, this sounds like Lewis, this sounds like so I remember specifically pulling off my shelf, it's easy to find a first edition of Letters to Malcolm, printed much later in his, actually posthumously it was published, but many more copies of it's pretty readily available. I remember pulling it off my shelf and thinking there's one or two sentences that just jumped out at me as Lewis wrote this. And then I went and typed them into a letter search engine, the collected letter search engine that I had made a few years previously, and it popped right up. So there was a letter that it was specifically pulled from to his publisher discussing how they were going to, move forward with the marketing, the dust jacket, and the production details and so on. That's when I'm like, okay, now I've got to look through it. And then just furiously, typing in all the blurbs that I could find, going through lists and online auctions and contacting collectors and people in the Lewis community who had these books that would give me pictures and so on. But yeah, that's the short answer. I was trying to come down with a definitive list of everything Lewis has published. And then I came across this, this tricky bit in the Till We Have Faces blurb that finally, that was the trigger that made me look through the rest of them.
Well, now, as already noted, determining whether Lewis wrote a blurb is not as straightforward as some people may think. So you've already described it to some extent, but why is that so? And what did you come up with to help you to vet the material to declare it as by Lewis?
Yeah, that was the most interesting part of the project, and it's something that hadn't been done in Lewis Scholarship before, which gave me freedom to come up with the tools and try to really satisfy myself that these are written by him or not. And sifting through, the 76 blurbs that I ended up finding, if you count American and British ones separately, that was the main challenge. That was really the draw, the academic challenge of doing it. So it depends on the blurb, of course. And the main thing, I suppose I could divide it into there's either internal evidence or external evidence. And external evidence is easier to come up with, easier to rely on, but it's less challenging and less rewarding in the long run, I found. So what I mean is, an external evidence might be a letter. I mean, anything that's outside of the words in the blurb itself. Um, so letters to his publisher, where he says, I've attached this blurb as you've requested, or letters from publishers back to him where they'll say, thank you for sending this. We'll go, we'll use this in our spring catalog, like they said for the blurb for a preface to Paradise Lost. So a lot of it has to do with his correspondence with publishers, because the blurb is either going to be written by an editor or somebody at the publishing house or by the author. It's going to be one of the two. So finding correspondence with the author is the main thing. I had also at the beginning of my project just hoped that I could find archival material where there would be something just in Lewis's hand you could see written out, kind of like we do have at least his blurb for the Lord of the Rings, and you can't see it because it's blurred out here, but
Yes,
on the
right.
back of my volume, you've got what he wrote about Lord of the Rings. So I was hoping I'd be able to find something like that. That was my main goal, really, was to contact all the archives at the publishing houses where he had, worked with the publishers to produce the book. And I knew that, there's the Lord of the Rings one. There, Michael Ward had found an unused blurb for The Abolition of Man just recently, just in the last few years. Same for Studies in Words. There was an unused draft blurb that another pair of scholars had published recently, I think in 2019 or thereabouts. And so I was hoping that I'd be able to find, like, I'd contact Oxford University Press or Cambridge University Press, or the Jeffrey Bless archives at the Waite Center, or any number of other publishing houses that put out his books, and then just find a manuscript that hadn't been published yet. And alas, none exist. I couldn't find anything that wasn't known already. I did end up finding a lot of other things, which maybe we'll get to later, but as far as external evidence goes, most of what I can rely on came from his published correspondence, where they'd be talking about the blurb text itself, or in some cases he'd be using a phrase that was identical to what he would use in what I would argue that he used in the blurb. So that's um, the gist of the external evidence. The internal evidence took a lot more time to develop, and there are many angles that you can look at the individual texts from. So probably the most obvious would just be the words themselves, the actual word choices, the vocabulary choices. And some of them just struck me as so quintessentially Lewisian, like I had known that he uses the word shocker when he's talking about um, thriller books that have a theological edge to them, and that he had described or learned of the Charles Williams novels as spiritual shockers, theological thrillers. And then when he described that hideous strength, or when the blurb describes that hideous strength as a shocker in that sense, I thought, oh, of course, this is the book that is most like the Charles Williams novels. People, famously Tolkien, will criticize it for that being too influenced by Williams. But to me, that was helpful background information to know that the vocabulary choice of the blurb resembles and is idiosyncratic in a way that you would only expect Lewis to have written it. And that there are different levels of that kind of technique, where sometimes I'll find the concept, maybe not the words exactly, but the same concept will appear all over Lewis's known corpus. So for instance, I mentioned that one phrase about removing obstacles to the enjoyment of Paradise Lost. So there's other places in his corpus. He does say, removing obstacles to the enjoyment, that does show up. But there's also places where he talks about removing obstacles to real appreciation. So it's you can tell that he's got the same concept, but he'll express it in different ways. And that's another way that I would use sort of internal evidence to the blurb to, I guess you could say at the same time, I'm also looking at evidence external to the blurb, but I would also look at the sentence structure. Sometimes the whole idea or movement of the sentence would match something in Lewis's works that would be pretty unusual, or you wouldn't expect someone to have. So again, what occurs to me is that hideous strength blurb where he talks about a certain concept of myths or fantasy or romances give a certain dimension of depth that you find in real life, but not in realistic fiction. Fiction that only includes the day-to-day mundane activities of normal people going around, excluding supernatural events and fantasy and other worlds, that sort of thing. So this dimension of depth that you only get in fantasy or non-realistic fiction, that's an unusual idea. And that kind of idea you can find in multiple places across his works. So that was another way of vetting that he had written a blurb, is that he used the same signature idea. And then as I sat with these texts, it took me about 3 years to finish the research and the writing process. I started noticing patterns between the blurbs themselves where he would do the same kind of thing in different contexts, where he's very, very often, for instance, he'll explain the title of the book in the blurb, usually for his academic books, or the way he refers to himself in the third person. He usually talks about himself as the author, instead of using the first person or referring to himself as Dr. Lewis. He does do that once. So I would look at the structure of the blurb as well. Like he'll start with, here's the explanation of the title, and then he'll go into here's all the concepts and basically a table of contents of what you can expect to learn about in the book. And then he'll end with something like, I called it evasive intrigue, where he'll give you a reason to read the book, but he won't spoil what the ending is, or he won't spoil what the point or the upshot of the argument is. So I noticed this pattern, and when I would see it in one of them and I recognized it in another, it made it more likely that, say the blurb for Miracles, which isn't very, doesn't have like a signature idea or a very recognizable phrase in it that you can point to another work and say this definitely came from. It does have one, but not that not quite something as obvious as, say, there's a phrase in the Pilgrim's Regress blurb that's very much like, oh, only Lewis would have written that, or that hideous strength one. So I guess that's that was really one of the more fun aspects of the project, was trying to come up with those methods of how could I be sure that he wrote this if all I've got to go on are the words. And it really came down to, individual vocabulary, the concepts, or sentence level ideas, and then looking at the whole structure of the thing. Does the movement of it match other ones that we know he had written. And usually, I'd say in the course of trying to vet them or authenticate them as really Lewis's work, there was a mixture of both. So it was very rare where I'd have the case of this. I had this was completely written by Lewis because I have an external letter where he just wrote it. That did happen once. The Four Loves British blurb. We do have his complete letter to Jeffrey Bless, or the publisher Jeffrey Bless. But the letter itself was to Jocelyn Gibb, and yeah, he's got it's all written there. It's almost verbatim, exactly the way it was printed on the dust jacket. But more often, what I would have is a combination where he'd say, "Okay, I sent the blurb to you," or there's some reason to think that he wrote it, but then no documentary evidence that proves it. So then I had to go through, even if I had reason to believe that, yes, he wrote a blurb for this book, I also had to go through the same kind of analysis of looking at the words, looking at the structure, looking at the concepts, and seeing, was there enough of a match to say, yes, I'm confident beyond reasonable doubt he did write this. It does mean, though, that there are some that I'm much more certain of than others. But I tried to divide the book, but mostly into, here's what he wrote for sure, here, and then here's what he didn't write, or I'm pretty sure, or we can't tell unless some other evidence comes up. Yeah, but that was definitely the most fun. I'd say the farther back you go, the less publishing archive material there is. So there's the most exists for Jeffrey Bless, and there's a lot of letters back and forth between him and Jocelyn Gibb in the 50s and 60s. But you go farther back, there's only a certain amount of material at the Oxford University Press archive. Some of it's been culled, some of it's no longer extant. But you go back to like the Dent and Sons for the Pilgrim's Regress, and there's hardly anything. There's or William Heinemann. I couldn't find an archive for William Heinemann, or if I did, there was nothing that far back for Spirits in Bondage. But yeah, so the farther back you go, the more I had to rely on conceptual parallels and verbal parallels. But yeah, I never did find what I was hoping to find, like the smoking gun of like, here's a manuscript that just let him, I could say, aha, I found this, and I can put it alongside, the studies in words and the abolition of man discoveries. And as far as that's concerned, no, that it seems like they've all been found.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, now you've touched on this in the answer you just gave, but I don't know if you have a different answer or if you want to highlight it here. But that is, what would be an example of a blurb that was fairly easy to determine was by Lewis?
The one that comes to mind is for Paralandra. It took me longer to prove that he wrote it than certain other ones, just because there were so many parallels in his published writings to the text of the Paralandra blurb. And it might be tedious to go through all of them, but some of them were so idiosyncratic. Like he'll say, popular science is the mythology of our age, and he's got passages in his theology poetry where he talks about the mythology of popular science, and that idea shows up in some of his private letters. He talks about the mythology that comes in the wake of science. He talks about, there's another phrase in the blurb where he talks about people might accuse this book of escapism, but this book isn't really wishful thinking. It's more like thoughtful wishing, and that same inverted phrasing comes in another passage in Lewis's works, and it was just one thing after another. It was actually I remember presenting it at the Undiscovered Lewis conference. I focused on this blurb just to show like the method could work of proving that he wrote a blurb that we have no um, correspondence about with his publishers. And everybody was like, "Yep, yep," nodding along, like, "Yep." They were seeing, this is slide after slide of here's one phrase in the blurb, and then here's 5 or 6 parallels to his written known corpus. And yeah, I'd say that was a pretty easy one. The other very, very easy ones, I'd say, were blurbs that yielded a direct match with some sentence from his collected letters. So, letters to Malcolm, there's just, a clear sentence that is just lifted verbatim from his correspondence and then grafted onto what's essentially the editor's blurb. It became a kind of co-authored piece, but Discarded Image was like that. There's a sentence about it. Reflections on the Psalms was the other one. So it seemed like toward the end of his life, he was letting his publisher take more of a lead, and he would correct it as he saw fit. But his earlier career, the sort of mid, 40s, early 50s, he'd be writing more, almost all of it. It's not a hard and fast rule, but yeah, I'd say the easiest one overall was Paralandra. It's like there's no way anyone but him wrote this. And then the times where we just have verbatim matches from the published collected letters made it easy to say, yeah, okay, he definitely wrote this.
Well, then on the other end of the spectrum here, what would be maybe an example of a blurb that was more challenging to declare was written by Lewis?
Yeah, so some of these, if you look at earlier drafts of my manuscript, it wasn't always so neatly divided into, okay, part 1, here's what he wrote, and then I've got the appendix of where here's what he didn't write, or it can't be determined, just because for a long time there was a third list of things that I really wasn't sure they might have been, but I couldn't tell. So there were a few that really just remained till the end, these unsolved, or to me, I wasn't satisfied with saying that he did. There were arguments for it, arguments against it, and I tried to weigh them all. The 2 that come to mind, well, maybe 3. The toughest one to crack was the Screwtape letters for me. I think that was the very last one that I can't quite remember in the research process now. It was either the Screwtape letters or Arthurian torso. I'm pretty sure it was Screwtape letters, but that one just didn't strike me as sounding. It didn't carry Lewis's voice to it the way that some of the other ones obviously did, and then I could document and back it up. And in fact, the 2 Lewis scholars who helped me edit the book were divided on it, where one of them thought, okay, yeah, this sounds like it was Lewis, and the other was not really convinced. He granted me that there is one sentence in there that does come verbatim from Lewis, but it's the kind of phrase where he talks about the gist of the whole book being it's instruction from a senior devil to a young devil on the art of temptation. So this phrase appears in Lewis's correspondence, but even that he thought maybe he was talking with his publisher, and the publisher rephrased it in his own, because it's the same concept. So he was pushing back on it, and that really led me to look at it in a level of detail that I had given few other of the blurbs. So I went back, I reread all of Screwtape, I reread the Screwtape Proposes a Toast, all the prefaces, Brenton's unused preface that he published in also in Notes and Queries, and read some similar wartime essays by Lewis, in particular, Learning in Wartime. And I found more, like the more I researched it, the more I came to the conclusion that he did write the Screwtape blurb, even though it doesn't have like a telltale phrase or a series of concepts that is so it has to be characteristic of him. So I'd say, yeah, probably Screwtape wins out as the most difficult. Probably number 2 would be Arthurian Torso. Maybe number 3 would be Miracles, because none of those 3 have a giveaway phrase or signature concept, but the more you look at them, you can see what, I mean, this might be interesting for your listeners to know about. For Arthurian Torso, the first edition blurb is completely different from the second impression of the book. It was totally rewritten in the second impression, and that's the impression I have. So I had to find, someone with a real first edition, first printing. But what I noticed with the second impression for Arthurian Torso, that to me it was one of the things that finally sealed the decision for me, was that it was written from the publisher's perspective. It doesn't say. I did find some blurbs that said, we thought it fit to publish this. It just talks about publishing details. The first few sentences are all about Charles Williams published 2 books of poetry. He left this thing unpublished. C.S. Lewis knew him, talked about it, and here's why you need to buy this book. So it was all about what you would expect a publisher to say. But then I would compare that with the original first printing Arthurian Torso blurb, and it was a totally different structure. It was all about, this book was left without a commentary. C.S. Lewis talked with Charles Williams about it and can give you this commentary. And that commentary has this very interesting, it advances a profound spiritual and technical, claim about a profound spiritual and technical importance of this book. So the whole, when you look at like the overall animating principle of the two and compare them, one was like trying to tell you about the publishing history and sell you the book, and the other was trying to say, you need a commentary to understand this book, and here's why you should buy this commentary. So it was very much like Lewis probably wrote this one and not this one, and sometimes the contrast helped between one version of a blurb and another to get that kind of seeing the forest instead of the trees, because I'd be looking at these blurbs and rereading these sentences so frequently that it was easier in many cases just to look up how many times does the word satire appear in Lewis's works, because the word satire appears in the blurb for Screwtape, or how many times does the word I don't know, frontline service show up, or I remember going through all of Screwtape and typing in almost every major adjective or noun that was in the blurb and trying to find, did it appear in the text itself. So there were cases where I would try to reinforce it that way. But yeah, in some cases it was actually harder to read the thing and notice major features of the blurb than it was just to look at very granular vocabulary details. But it was all very fun to do. But I'd say, yeah, overall, it took me till the very end of the project to be convinced myself that Screwtape, the blurb for Screwtape, was written by Lewis.
Well, very interesting. Well, now, how about what was the most surprising thing that came about as a result of the research that you did?
Yeah, I guess because I was looking for, printed, handwritten, drafts of blurbs and didn't find them, I was much more surprised that I ended up finding new letters that hadn't been touched or discovered before. So what would happen is I would try and contact the publishing houses, American and British, of the books that Lewis had published, or in some cases the authors' archives. So what happened was several of the blurbs that I found that he wrote for other people's books, and there's a whole section in the supplement volume about those, almost as many as blurbs that he wrote for his own books. Those would show up in newspaper articles or magazines and so on. And then I got interested, of course, in finding, sometimes the newspaper quote would also be on the dust jacket, sometimes it wouldn't be. But in any case, I wanted to check with those publishing houses if there was correspondence between the author or the editor. And one time I found a book that I never heard of, but that took its name from Paralandra. It was called Times Corner. And when I looked up the author's archives, I found that there was a whole correspondence between Lewis and this author, Nancy Wilson Ross, that there was no reference to in Lewis scholarship. It hadn't been published before. So um, it was surprising and fun to me to have a small 2-inch image of an old newspaper with a very short quote, otherwise very uninteresting. What Lewis's positive opinion about this book, and then to find that he had written her this several manuscript long page long evaluation of her book where he's very positive and he gives her all of this his reactions, and he'll point out specific page numbers and say, I really enjoyed this, or this needed to be said, or that so uncovering that, and you could see the reaction of the author was she was so touched, and she just read it over and over. I'm sure that's part of the reason it was preserved in her papers as long as it had been. But that kind of thing was surprising to me. And a similar thing happened where I had been looking for what I actually we'll get to. This verges more on most disappointing territory. But when I was looking for something that I thought might be a whole new essay by Lewis, and I ended up finding what I found instead was a letter that Walter Hooper had donated to the Bodleian, but he had forgotten to put in the collected letters. Now, of course, the letter that I found disproved my whole theory of hoping that I was going to find a new Lewis essay. It turned so what he had done was this is for a piece that Lewis fanatics will know. It's called A Tribute to E.R. Edison, and it's a short, paragraph about how much Lewis enjoys the worm Ouroboros and E.R. Edison's fiction. And they had corresponded. Edison even went to an Inklings meeting at one point. And this tribute is actually on the dust jacket of a posthumously published book by Edison. Now, what I had found in researching the publication history of that book was Lewis had promised to write a preface, a whole new introduction or preface to the worm Ouroboros, and he agreed to it on multiple occasions. And so I'm thinking this paragraph is probably a short excerpt from this lost essay. So I'm thinking I'm going to, have the discovery of, the discovery of the century. I get a new Lewis essay on literary criticism for a book he loved. And that led me to, find all of the places where he corresponded with this publisher who was trying to get E.R. Edison's works, more recognized, and trying to bring out a new edition of the worm Ouroboros, and basically trying to be his literary executor and get everything published. So I found this guy's name is George Rostraver Hamilton. I found his, I looked in the publishing, the Kirwan Papers Press, they had published the book. I looked in George Rostraver Hamilton's correspondence at the Bodleian. I looked at any correspondence from him to Lewis at the Bodleian and other places. And what I ended up finding instead of this new essay was a letter where Lewis says, oh, it's okay if you've got someone else, if you've got someone else to write this introduction, basically, and then he says, also, I'd forgotten all about it. So he had simply not done it. And that was probably the most disappointing thing that I found. Like, oh, okay. And then I ended up having to rewrite, I had paragraphs in my manuscript about how there's this lost Lewis essay, and maybe it's in one of these archives, and maybe it's still, someone could still find it. And of course, the conclusion was really, no, it was never written. He had intended to, but didn't. Someone else ended up writing the introduction to the eventual American edition. But yeah, I'd say what I was most surprised by was how much correspondence there was that hadn't been tapped by the Lewis scholarship community. So there's several new letters in the book as well, not just the collected text of all the blurbs. Yeah.
Kind of like the best of times and the worst of times with that
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. Yeah. It was so I got to publish new letters.
Oh,
Didn't expect to do that, but no new essays.
yeah. Well, you tipped your hat to the fact that you did get these questions in advance here. So you thinking through here about, which is no secret if people watch or listen to my material here, interviews. But yeah, was there anything disappointing from your work? You know, whether it be something that you found disappointing yourself or you thought others might
Mhm.
find disappointing?
Yeah, yeah, both come to mind. One is I had been hoping to find. I was very pleased to find the preface to Paradise Lost um, blurb, just because that's my favorite work of Lewis's nonfiction, his literary criticism, and I was also hoping to find um, a blurb for Surprised by Joy, which is my personal favorite of his nonfiction works, criticism or otherwise. So when I found out that no, in fact, he had not written a blurb for Surprised by Joy, that was personally disappointing. I wanted to be able to add somehow to that book's legacy. But the other thing I thought would be disappointing is that in no case could I definitively say that he wrote one of the blurbs for the Narnia books or for Mere Christianity or for The Problem of Pain. So almost all of his most famous books, with the exception of Screwtape, he didn't seem to have any direct influence over them. For instance, there is no blurb for Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on the first edition Dust Jacket. And the ones on several of the others that were published by Jeffrey Bless are so short, you just can't tell who wrote them. And then it's possible, he might have written the plot synopsis for The Horse and His Boy and The Magician's Nephew. So he might have written a few sentences of those blurbs, but you know, it, I was disappointed that there was no big Narnia news. That would be headline worthy. People
Mm.
would love to know that there's more Narnia material. Um, but yeah, I mean, just personally, it was uh, the more Lewis, the better. I want to read everything that he wrote, that he published. And in the cases where he didn't contribute to the books, especially the more famous ones or the ones that meant more to me, I was hoping that there would be some new material, but there wasn't.
Mm, yeah. Well, now, of course, that doesn't stop either you or me from trying to write a clickbaity bait type
Sure.
article when the new movie comes out to where what did Lewis summarize as his Narnia thing? Da 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 da, and then you have
Yeah.
a long intro about trying to find it, and then at the end of the article, oh, he didn't. He didn't say anything.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, you could. There's a clickbait article somewhere about the Screwtape one because and if you buy my argument, he mentions Hitler by name, so you could have Hitler inspired Screwtape question mark, and
Yeah,
then that'll get some attention, I'm sure. But yeah,
yeah. Yes, and then you could tie in current political things, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. Yeah, so now with everything that you've done, and it's quite a bit of a detective work. It's like anyone who's going to write on this topic is going to have to, acknowledge, look at what you've done. You have laid the groundwork, the foundation, or the more thorough. There's been others that have touched on it, or at least the one other
mhm,
that you made reference
mhm.
to previously and stuff. But anyway, but what do you see is left to do in this area of Lewis studies?
Yeah, yeah. A couple of directions I could see right off the bat. Number one is I don't think we found all of the blurbs that Lewis wrote for other people, and in fact, just a few months after I had published it, Aran Smilda sent me two more newspaper clippings of books that Lewis wrote blurbs for that had not come to my attention or been had appeared in any of my searches on old newspaper archives and things. So those two have come up. I would guess that there's probably another maybe dozen At one point in his correspondence, Lewis says, "I've written so many blurbs, and I don't do it at all well." He was sick of it by the end of his life. So, I found uh, 26 that he wrote for other people, probably 25, depending on how you count them. But now we're up to 27, 28. I could see, another dozen in there giving him even more justification to say, "I'm sick of writing all of these." So I think number one is keep hunting. There's a couple I think that haven't been found. I'll give listeners my idea for it if you want to go for looking through. What I would recommend is go from like 1930 onwards in his personal library and look through all of the books in his personal library that survive at the Wade Center and at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Find the ones that were published after 1930 and then see what their dust jackets look like. Because often what would happen is the publishers would send him a complimentary copy of the book that he had helped contribute a blurb for, or that they wrote, they would write to him to get his opinion on it. And then if he wrote back, he would always write back. And if he liked it, he would tell them. And maybe they would use that on the US version. So what I would do is go through his library and check anything that, where especially after he became famous in the early 1940s, people would send him books just hoping for a free, advertisement from him. Go through those and look for more. So that, I mean, it will be laborious. I'll probably do a little bit of it. I'm not sure I'll go through every single one. Maybe if I run out of other projects. But the other thing that would be very interesting to see is if people take these blurbs and put them, assume that they're written by Lewis, if they agree with me, and then work them into some kind of literary study on their own projects. Because now there's more evidence that you can use in developing arguments and interpretations about Lewis's work. The one thing that comes to mind is if you wanted to know about his rhetorical strategies, how was he trying to sell his books? That's something I didn't really look at much. I reference it a little bit, but what did he think would be most appealing about his books? And how was he trying to sell them? How does it compare with, other authors, other Inklings, other contemporary authors? What were they trying to highlight? Are there pieces of his blurbs that point to features of the book that have been neglected or that scholars even disagree with? So it would be fun for me to see other scholars doing interpretation on specific works to just take into account these extra 100 or 200 words we've got for many of these important texts and make some kind of use of them. And I don't know where it will go, but I suppose the thing that would most please me is if the new editions of the books themselves included, supplementary material like, here's a reproduction scan of the dust jacket. Here's the text of the blurb. Here's the first 10 reviews that came out. So I could see there being, critical editions of some of them, and maybe start with the academic works, but, Screwtape, I could see there being, I don't know, 100th anniversary Screwtape with all the original texts restored, in another 20 years or so. But yeah, there is still some stuff left to do, I'd say. And yeah, if anyone finds anything, by the way, if any of your audience finds stuff, send it to me. I'd be very interested to know if there's a new discovery or newly found published works by Lewis.
Okay. And I'm also thinking this is not anything maybe that needs further research because I think you dive pretty well in it, but I kind of mention it as a tease as, okay, people have listened to this interview. It's like, okay, I know enough about it. I don't need to get the actual book itself, but here's something that we won't talk about, but you do
Sure.
touch on, and that is about Lewis and his blurb, as well as he did reviews for Tolkien's work, the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And so, if
That's
people
right.
want to see was that something Lewis wanted to do? Did he think it was going to have a positive impact? Maybe if you want to give a short tease
Oh,
about
sure, sure. Yeah.
that, if
One of
people
the
want
only
to.
authors that he wrote multiple blurbs for is Tolkien, and he shows up. for both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings in the second part of the volume. And I'll say that the most research I did, the most material I found on a single blurb was for Lord of the Rings. We have the whole history of it, and it's never been written before. From the very conception of, in Tolkien's letters, you can see him struggling to write a blurb when his publishers ask him to do it. He nominates Lewis for it. You see Lewis's reaction. You see him composing the blurb. You see the reviewer. I quote, I went through all the contemporary reviews of Lord of the Rings and found where people were, quoting it, making fun of it, lampooning it, and the whole critical story comes out in that one. Most of the time I just give, okay, here's where Lewis mentions this author and his works. Here's what the dust jacket says. Here's his opinion of, here's the rest of his correspondence if you wanted to look it up. But for the Tolkien one, it's the longest section of the book, and it covers, from conception to reception, the whole history of Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien's fans will be intrigued by the detail of it. I even I'll give there's one part that did not make it into the book, Tolkien related, and that is I had gone through The Hobbit. I'll tell you this: Tolkien fans and Tolkien scholars are even more fanatical about finding every single variant and version of Tolkien's publication than I found Lewis fans and scholars are. So I found every single impression of The Hobbit that had been printed during Lewis's lifetime. And it would be much harder to find images of every single impression, say, of Screwtape or, the Narnia books. But anyway, I had gone through and detailed the changes in the dust jacket design and the changes in wording for every single impression. And my editor was saying, this is too much for a niche academic journal publication. It's too much, which he was totally right about. But for myself, I wanted to make sure I'd covered the basis of looking at every single variation and checking. What I found was Lewis had only written, was only quoted on the second impression of The Hobbit and none of the others. So, and it was interesting because he was quoted as if he were two people on different sections of the jacket. So it wasn't attributed to him, it was anonymous. So it was very interesting. But yeah, I'd say there's plenty of stuff that we haven't touched on. There's all the blurbs that he didn't, that were not for his own books, but for other people's. And then you could even look in the appendix and see if you disagree with me that Lewis didn't write some of the blurbs. That would be a fun thing to go through. Is did he really not write the blurb for Dimer or the Narnia books? That would be a great discovery if someone could prove otherwise, that there's more to it than even I had thought. So yeah, go pick it up. There's not many of them out there, but go pick it up. It's worth it if you want to read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so how can people get a copy of it?
So there's only one place. It's just the Journal of Inklings Studies website. They have a separate section for ordering supplements. It's a very low print run. It's really for Lewis enthusiasts and hobbyists and scholars who want to have read everything he wrote and want to have a definitive account of this, what really is a new, unrecognized genre of his entire writing career. So yeah, go to the Inklings Studies supplements website, pick it up, and yeah, maybe there will be enough demand that I'll be able to correct the annoying typos I found just weeks after it was published. And actually, a couple of scholars had sent me very minor, but to me significant errors of fact. So if anyone does find other issues, I'd be happy to know. Have it be as truthful as possible. So yeah. Can't find it on Amazon though.
And that's happened to no other author. That just after.
Yeah, no. This is the first time that anyone made a mistake in print.
Yeah. Yeah. But now, if others want to know more about you, where can they find you online?
Well, you had reached out to me on LinkedIn. I'm there. I've got a GitHub repository GitHub profile and repository at jwkeena.github.io. You can also find me on the Opera Obscura website, where I've got the list of all of Lewis's new and obscure works. I've got my email linked on there. And yeah, I could just give people my email address in the show notes, or whatever you'd like. And I'd be happy to hear from people if they've got some corrections or additions, or just want to talk about how much they like Lewis and the obscure boundaries of his works.
Excellent. Yeah, and yeah, so yeah, in the description, we'll have the links to how to get the journal, and then the other things that you mentioned as well. So great. Well, Justin, this has been very fascinating. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about C.S. Lewis, Blurbologist.
Thanks, William. It's wonderful to be on the program after years of listening to it. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Justin. There are links in the description for buying a copy of C.S. Lewis, Blurbologist, and how to reach Justin and find him online. Thanks for watching Essential C.S. Lewis on YouTube, a feature of EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty. I also have a channel on YouTube called Adult Autism with William, where I share about only learning I was autistic at age 60, along with understanding level 1 autism from the perspective of an adult, and there are also interviews with other autistic adults. At EssentialCSLewis.com, you can find a variety of material, including various interviews with authors of titles related to Lewis. Please consider liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. Finally, please follow the link in the description to learn more about my books, and that includes my latest, the Screwtape Letters Handbook.